Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Rushing the Field. He's Joshua Perry. I'm Nicole Auerbach. And we're a couple days removed from the national championship game. JP, I got out of Atlanta, which I feel like I need to go buy a lottery ticket because did you see those photos of the security lines? Morning after
Yes.
the game was insane. I go to the airport, 5 minutes in the security line. There was like a line on the left that people didn't seem to know was a security line. Whatever it was. And then my flight, I had like an hour and a half delay, but I got out. Some of our friends, like Mike Golick Jr., some people I think slept at the airport last night. So
No
it
shot.
was a
No shot.
rough travel. Atlanta was not ready for snow. Was not ready for snow.
Yeah. I mean, I still haven't seen my guy, Jake Butt, back in the city of Chicago yet, the former Michigan All-American
Did he
tight
get
end.
stuck?
He was down there covering the game. I don't think he could get a flight back that would have got him there for yesterday. And so what is today? Today is
Wednesday. We're recording this Wednesday.
We're taping it. So to get him back on Tuesday, which would have been the day after the game, he couldn't get a flight. But I'm not sure he ever made it back because he's never confirmed that.
It was like a disaster at that airport. And like, of course, then you have snow. Like I have friends trying to get to Louisiana and like that was just covered in snow.
Yeah, good luck getting to Louisiana with their sheet of snow.
Snow on the beach. It was crazy seeing all that stuff in Florida and Louisiana. So hopefully everyone listening who went to the game got home safely. We wanted to do just kind of like a full-on debrief with a little bit more space off the national championship game. I did want to start just kind of like big picture about where these two programs are, and then we'll get into like what we learned specifically from the inaugural 12-team college football playoff. But let's start with Ohio State. National champs, Ryan Day, all the monkeys are off his back. He won a bunch of big games. He won a national championship. A lot of these guys are going to go pro, but this felt like to me, and I've seen a lot of people saying this, it's not going to be replicable. Like, you have to hit on your transfers. You have to have really great veteran leaders. But it feels like that the way that they approach building this roster is something that other people are going to try to do in the NIL era.
I mean, it's kind of the Michigan, what they did to build their roster for the championship run. They had some players that were kind of, 50-50. Do I leave? Do I go? Got those guys to come back. They had some impact transfers that were there as well. They kept developing guys that were below some of the top level dudes as well. And I think that mattered for them. And so I think there's at least a 2-year sample size of the idea of having a strong veteran nucleus for your team being a part of what you can do there. Now, it becomes a little bit more difficult. I am a believer that with the COVID year ending, like some of this veteran stuff becomes a little bit different, right? Like you don't have some guys who were legitimately able to, be around for forever, but it does matter that they had it. Penn State's trying to do that right now, by the way. They need to get some wide receivers, though. It's a little bit of an issue for that room. But I do think this was like, it feels like there were things that were aligning for them in terms of one last chance to do anything important too. And I don't think you can replicate that feeling for players and what made them flip the switch heading into the postseason. But I do think there is going to be a template in terms of roster construction for let's pay guys who have been really productive for us and see if we can get them back. We'll also have to pay some dudes who maybe haven't played a ton, but we know they're going to be good players, so they stick around and we can have depth. And let's identify a handful of guys, 5 to 10 guys out of the portal that we need to have on our roster.
And you supplement with them. You can't build an entire roster off the portal, but you've got to hit on those specific positions, but also you supplement, and they did, right? Like Will Howard and Quinshon Judkins, Caleb Downs, huge players for this championship run. So, yeah, people got to feel pretty good about how things are going in Columbus right now. Let's flip it over to where Notre Dame is. Obviously, we talked about this in our instant reaction pod. I think there was a very real fear early in the game that it was going to be a little bit like the Alabama national championship game where you feel like you didn't belong on the field. And then there's like these sweeping judgments people are going to have about you or major takeaways. But Notre Dame did belong. There were some moments and some calls. And just, again, we talked about the limitations of their offense and the way that they could score points. The health of Jeremiah Love was a question. Like there were a lot of pieces that came into play in that game. How do you feel about where the Irish are moving forward? And, with Marcus Freeman at the helm, again, he's still only 39. They may be losing at least one coordinator, but what's the state of the Irish?
Yeah, I mean, I feel good about them. I felt like that game probably went the way that I would have seen it going, where I felt like Ohio State was a better team with the better roster, but Notre Dame was a team that was going to fight and was never going to go down easy. For Marcus Freeman, I think it is remarkable in just a few years the way that he's built that program into something that we seriously look at as a contender right now. Of course, there's like you got to make sure that you don't have that one letdown game, but like he's big game ready, and that's apparent to me. I do think it's intriguing what they end up doing. They've got CJ Carr, who's kind of waiting in the wings. I know people have been excited about him. That might open up their offense too, to be able to utilize a guy like Jaden Greathouse, who came on very late in the year. Last 2 games for him were both phenomenal. Jeremiah Love is back as well. Boubacar Traore is going to be back off of injury. Like they've got some guys, to me, to where I do think they can start to pick up the pieces and build something that could be very good for next year. Al Golden potentially being out the door, I think, is a huge deal because he is a veteran guy on that coaching staff who's been a head coach, and he wasn't a great one. So he could go and tell Marcus all the things not to do. Hey, Marcus, these are things that got me in trouble when I was a head coach. We shouldn't do this as a program. And he's going to have to find that voice that he can really lean on to help him with those things.
The CJ Carr thing is going to be really interesting because there were rumors swirling about maybe Notre Dame was going to take a transfer quarterback. But Marcus has been really clear. He wants to go with the homegrown quarterback strategy. They've done the 1-year quarterback rentals, but here is them saying, here is our quarterback of the future, and we are going to have him for multiple years, and we're going to see how that all goes. But yeah, it was a phenomenal season for them. And I think because of the fight in the game, the way they came back, you feel differently about Notre Dame, and you can build off of that. The wins against Georgia, the wins against Penn State, the wins over some really, really good football teams. But it will be very interesting to see what happens with the defensive staff and other potential changes. These 2 teams also now have a portal window. So you could see some departures and some movement in the next couple of days from the 2 teams in the championship game. JP, let's go broader about the first year of the 12-team college football playoff. I think there were things we thought might happen. There were, dynamics or side effects we anticipated, some we didn't. So I'm writing a piece on NBCSports.com. Depending on when you listen to it, it may be up, it may not be up yet. But I'm going to talk about like the 12 lessons I learned from it. So I want to start with some positives, and then we'll get into, I know you got some thoughts about the regular season and rivalry games, but positives. We thought on-campus games were going to be awesome, and they were awesome. Yes. I've had so many conversations with different administrators, about how do you capitalize on that? How can you add a round with on-campus games in the quarterfinals so the top 4 seeds get the opportunity to host games too? It's complicated, but I hope we get there. This is one of the things, if I could wave a magic wand, I would change. But to me, that was one of the major takeaways and major positives of this system was you had meaningful postseason playoff games for campus environments, and they were all electric.
Yeah, I'm totally there with you. I thought it was special, and it's the thing that we love about the regular season is some of the environments that we get to watch these games in. So to put the postseason implications on those environments, I thought was great. And it felt like once we got to the second round, we missed out on that with the teams that probably deserve to be able to host instead of going to a neutral site. Not to mention neutral sites, very expensive for fan experience and also just sterile. They don't feel like big time college atmosphere. So to be able to watch that first weekend, and I know we can talk about, potential matchups and seeding and how it might have felt a little bit lopsided and whatever the case is, just to get the visuals of those games on campus, I thought was spectacular. And you've talked to, like you said, administrators about it. I've talked to a bunch of fans about it, and they were in love with what happened during that first round. And I think that's what the sport needs to keep in mind as well is how does all of what is changing impact the fan experience?
100%. And I think I cited this before, but my pal, Pete Sampson at The Athletic, who covers Notre Dame, found a fan who spent over $7,000 to go to all of the games to see their favorite team play for a national championship. That's crazy. That's crazy. Yep. And I'm not saying that on campus tickets or to stay in your college town and travel there would be like dramatically cheaper, but yeah, it would. And you're going back to the place that like means a lot to you. I'd rather go and travel for an on-campus game. There's some calendar issues. I think if you keep it the way that it is, those campus games in a quarterfinal would be right around New Year's. So that's complicated, but we'll get to things that we would love to see change in just a second. Another thing that I really like, Joshua, and I know you had some issues with this about like the meaning of the regular season, but I loved that we didn't have to write teams off after one loss in September. That Notre Dame had something to play for and could get better over the course of the season after losing to NIU and stay in the playoff mix. And obviously they even hosted a game. But like there were so many years where, Clemson losing to Georgia in week 1, we'd be like, all right, Clemson's out, no chance to make the playoff. And then you kind of ignore them the entire rest of the season. There were so many teams, especially even 2-loss, eventually 3-loss teams, that stayed in the conversation, stayed in the mix. And that allowed us to have so many meaningful games in November. Basically every Big 12 game in November had playoff implications. Like that sort of thing was a goal of the playoff, to engage and keep people engaged more, because you're not writing people off, you're not eliminating them. But that part I think was another huge win with the model.
I'm there with you, and we can talk about the cost of some of it a little bit later on. But I do believe, and this is partially because I'm biased, I played for a team that had an ugly loss early in the season. Like I believe that teams evolve, and I think that they change. And so this idea of Notre Dame having like this inexplicable ugly loss, but then having the second best point margin throughout the regular season, like yes, it's a very different team by the end of the year. I'm even there with the idea of the way that some of these conferences are structured, the 2-loss teams having an opportunity in the postseason. It was the thing that we talked about during the 14 playoff era, is that, you never saw a 2-loss team make it in there. And we felt like some of those teams, given the right matchup, given the opportunity, it's just the fact that their schedule set up in a way where they played really difficult games. They would have been able to make noise there. So I certainly am glad to see that. We'll talk about the flip side of it, obviously. But we have to get ourselves into a place where we stop looking at things that happen in September and making that an indictment on a team in November. These teams can be completely different. Personnel changes, scheme changes, coaching gets better. All those different things matter. They happen throughout the course of a year.
What were some of the things you liked first year of the new model?
I personally, I like the idea that we got some of the matchups that we saw at the end of the year, right? Like the Big Ten SEC thing that we had with Ohio State a couple of times. Like I think people have always dreamed about those types of matchups. Honestly, the in-state matchup with Indiana and Notre Dame, I thought that was a super fun thing for us to see. And so this idea that like, we got to the Final Four and, based off of the paths of like, some cream's got to rise to the top, got 4 blue bloods in there, right? And like, I think it was exciting to see some of that. But even the round before that, we saw one of the teams who kind of got in on the back end, who really challenged Texas, Arizona State, the great season that they had. So I do think the matchups and kind of some of the storylines that were developed there were certainly something that you could grab onto by the end of the year.
Yeah, I think so too. And that's one of the things that, again, anticipated, you're actually going to play this stuff out on the field instead of the hypotheticals and instead of these ideas of how, different leagues stack up, or, the second best team in different leagues stack up against each other. You actually get to play it out. And I think that part was awesome. You had 11 CFP games instead of 3. So when you talk about, opt-outs, didn't really see any high profile opt-outs, right? Everybody played. You saw like some second string guys go into the portal for some of the teams, and that was about it. Everybody else played. People played through injuries because these games meant a lot. So that certainly achieved that goal. I also think that I expected a little bit more of a drop off, or the idea of like these quote meaningless bowl games to be a little bit more quote meaningless. But there were some awesome bowl games, and like I'm partial to the Pop-Tarts and the mayo and like the ones that have they're up to their antics. But there were so many close games, crazy comebacks. Like the rest of bowl season, I thought that was a positive as well. Somehow, I think maybe that we were trying to honor both, like the path and the path to the playoff, but also the rest of it. And maybe some were contractual, that like your NIL deals required you to play in the playoff game or a postseason game. But I thought that the rest of the bowl season also ended up being really strong. Like the regular season was great. You had a bunch of crazy games. bunch of crazy games in the bowls, and then you had a really good college football playoff too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that does speak to just what college football was this year and how balanced it felt at times, where matchups on any given weekend could feel really intriguing. But I think there's also this flip side of it, which is a benefit to the playoff, is we got wrapped up in so many more storylines with so many more teams that we kind of wanted to see how they would finish. Like, I'm sitting there as somebody who was like down on Lincoln Riley. USC is a dumpster fire. And we watched them open up with an SEC team and win, and then have a ridiculous comeback against Texas A&M and win that game. And like, I'm not sure that I would typically want to watch a 6-6 USC team, but I'm also a sicko, so I typically turn on the bowl games. But I was in there to watch them just to see what the end of the season was going to look like and what tone that would set for the offseason. So I do think this idea of maybe more teams that we're looking at and, you know, where they're at certain points of the year in terms of their ability to compete for the actual playoff led us to, well, I might as well watch them finish their season because I followed them for so much.
Yeah, and you were just intrigued, right? Because we weren't only talking about like the same 4 to 6 teams every year, which I think in the 4-team era, there were only about 6 teams that were really in the mix to compete or get a spot in the first place. There are a couple years where someone would kind of come out of nowhere, like a TCU, but for the most part, you could pencil in teams. You knew which programs were going to be the ones feeding teams into the playoff or had the schedule to do it. So I think that was a huge positive. I'm neutral on this, but one of my bigger takeaways, and I think that people have been debating this of like, you know, you're never going to really see a true Cinderella team win the college football playoff. Like, no kidding. You have to win 3 or 4 games. You have to be extremely talented and extremely deep. We saw the injuries that these teams had to overcome, but just the wear and tear. Of course, this was going to be a system that was going to benefit the Ohio States of the world, that you were going to get mulligans. The teams with the most talent were going to get mulligans. And the best teams, or the names of the teams, were going to be the same ones that we're used to seeing. Although, by the way, Texas and Penn State, that's still, even though Texas went last year, count them as fresh blood. But right. Yeah, of course, Alabama and Georgia and those types of teams are going to have opportunities to get to the very end. You know, if Georgia doesn't lose their starting quarterback, maybe they're there at the end. But that's okay. I've always said that. I'm okay if those are the teams. Like the championship games look similar to how they always were, because it was going to be more interesting to get there. And we learned so much about the teams on the way to the championship game that I'm totally fine with that. It's kind of the argument with March Madness. Like, do you want the blue bloods at the end? Sure, they're great, but it's more interesting to get there, and you might see some upsets. But I don't think you're going to have true Cinderellas. I mean, the closest we got was Arizona State, and they were a conference champion, so it wasn't even truly like an Indiana or something like that. They might win a game, but man, 3 or 4 games through some of the best teams in the country, that's going to be hard on an annual basis. But I think that's okay. I think that's okay that you're not going to necessarily have a Cinderella there, lifting the trophy at the very end. The fact that they have access to it and can maybe pull off an upset, that's the fun part.
I'd argue that Cinderella did lift the trophy this year. You know, like,
well, we're not going to call
team, but they wouldn't have been in under the BCS. They wouldn't have been in the 4-team playoff. And here they are as a team that, in the path that they had to take too. It wasn't like they had the Penn State path that was lined up for them. Like, I know it's not a traditional Cinderella because it's like the most talented roster, but we're looking at a 2-loss team, and their second loss was at the end of the year, in a point where everything could have fallen apart. I'd argue that Notre Dame, in terms of they were in the playoff every week after they lost to NIU, does feel like it could be a Cinderella story. It was a 7 versus 8 matchup in the national title. I know part of that is because of seeding. That's not how we would actually rank those teams. But I think for college football, we probably have to look at it a little bit different than we look at the NCAA tournament and what a team that goes on a Cinderella run might actually look like. It's probably the team that, whether it was self-inflicted or not, was not necessarily great in the regular season, and then everything starts to click for him because the talent and the coaching all comes together.
I think if you underachieve in the regular season and then go on a run, I don't think you get to be called a Cinderella. That will be
it's a different thing, but like it's basically what it is, though. It's the team that would have not been a champion, and they become the champion. Because,
which, by the way, like we talked about this. Your team in 2014, I think, validated the 4-team playoff by being like, yes, we would not have been in this if it was only 2. Same thing with this Ohio State team. We would not have been in it if it was only 4. So it validates the reason to like cast a wider net, even if you're going to have blowouts, and there's clearly teams in the 12 that are not at that level, that are not national championship, you do need to cast a wider net to make sure you find the right one.
In football so I think, and in society, by the way, cast a wide net.
Yes. Yeah, no, these are, I think that's one of the big takeaways from this. But the flip side, Joshua, is that you can lose to Northern Illinois or you can lose to Michigan. Your season's not over. And wow, you still have a lot to play for after that. I know that bothered you. Like what, obviously we're not going back, but how much did that bother you?
I think it's just interesting. Like the NIU thing, you can make an argument that loss early in the year shouldn't be disqualifying, even if it was still a 14 format, depending on what happened with everything else. It's a one-loss team. We've seen those teams get in. But this idea of losing at the very end of the year, it's not something that we had really seen, where you could lose to a bad team like that for your second loss and still feel like you can compete for a title. So just from that standpoint, it was weird. But also the implication on that rivalry game, which I think is the best rivalry in college football. I've got friends who are like you, went to Michigan supporters, whatever the case is. And basically they're like, oh man, haha, whatever, put a star next to the championship. And my response to them is, when I played, it mattered. My 4 pairs of gold pants mattered. That there was never a champion for The Ohio State University that ever lost to Michigan until this year. It does not matter anymore. The result of that game is not as impactful. You might feel bad. We felt bad for 7 weeks or whatever the case was. And now there are a lot of people who are ready to turn the page. There are people who are like, it is what it is. Like we don't even think about that anymore. And any Michigan fan who wants to come and talk to me about it, I'm not trying to hear it. And we did that so everything else could feel more important.
But here's the thing.
It's a weird spot for us.
But here's the thing. That game still meant so much. There was a fight on the field because of how much it meant to the players. And
absolutely,
I didn't realize that fans had posted Ryan Day's home address, and that was part of the reason that the security got. But that's because that game mattered, even though everyone knew as soon as that game finished.
Like that moving forward, though?
But everyone knew even this year that Ohio State was going to be in the playoff.
We didn't know that they would actually finish the job. And now that we
knew that they would be in it.
It changes the way that we think about it. If we would have known right after that game that Ohio State was absolutely going to win the title, I don't think people would have had the same emotions. Ryan Day's address would have been posted.
But you would never know that for sure. And I think we still knew for sure that they were going to be in the bracket. We knew that they had a really good chance to host a game still.
Right.
Even after losing that game.
I guess my point now is, like, now that we've seen that actually happen, now that
we'll
the hypothetical that we have always talked about is, lose to Michigan, whatever. But like, hey, if you lost to them and you won a national title, how do you feel?
Right.
People feel pretty damn good right now.
Yeah. People didn't think it was actually going to happen.
No.
And so therefore it's right. The next time, the next time someone loses to their rival at the end of the year, you're like, oh, maybe it'll just spark a run. Just like, that's what would be funny for Michigan fans. Would you rather beat Ohio State and then like ignite something in them and they win a national championship, or lose that game?
Well, I think Michigan fans right now are like, damn, like we were going to hold this over their head, and they really don't care right now. They really don't care. They had us to a point where we were ready to fire the coach, and it doesn't matter. It literally doesn't matter anymore. Like, you can't hurt us.
He should probably still beat Michigan next year.
I don't disagree with that.
But here's the thing.
I'll give you some insight real quick.
But the thing is, like, Ohio State made the playoff in the 4-team era after losing to Michigan too. You just think it feels different because
they actually
won.
Yes.
Because I just think like that piece has been there. There have been those exceptions where teams have lost those games and still gotten in. But maybe just because you do have so much more space and so much more wiggle room, that
and
feels
it was a second loss too. And I felt like that was the other thing, where that is always disqualifying. Like, usually, in our mind as college football fans, like, you're a 2-loss team. You're not going to make it into the postseason. You're not going to be able to win a championship. And so I think it's rewired us in a lot of ways to consider what a successful regular season looks like as you're gearing up to play in the postseason. Last thing I'll say real quick, I talked to Urban Meyer, coached me at Ohio State, and he's still hell-bent on this got to beat Michigan thing. You got to do it. We can't let people say that it doesn't matter as much anymore because you can still make it to the playoff and you can still win a champ. championship. And I'm one of those people who feels that way. But when I'm doing my bad faith arguments, which is one of my greatest skills to Michigan fans, I'm going to act like it doesn't matter.
All right. Well, at least you're telling us in advance.
Well, you know how I operate. I'm letting the world know.
Yes, I've seen your candy list for Halloween, your favorite candies.
That's legit. I love Werther's.
Mm-hmm. There's some other ones that you always throw in there just for engagement bait, but
Necco wafers.
I do. For me personally, the fact that so many more regular season games had more at stake because teams didn't have to be perfect, outweighs the fact that, you don't have to be perfect. And like, this was a sport where like any given Saturday could just blow up your entire season. I still think the benefits outweigh that, but I do understand a lot of people who are upset by that, every Saturday wasn't like life or death like it was years ago.
I'll say this too, and I know this is certainly not going to change, but it feels to me that 8 would do the job that we would really want, where Ohio State fans, if it was an 8-team playoff, after they lost to Michigan this year, you're on that bubble, right? Like it would have been a genuine question of, okay, are we firmly, solidly in, or are we going to be one of the teams that's on the outside looking in, right? And so I think that kind of satisfies this idea of the drama and still potentially that the second loss having some meaning for teams. The other thing that is kind of wild to me, the more that I thought about it, is we saw a 3-loss team make it in, and we had arguments about 3-loss teams making it in. And the more that I think about the idea that those are teams that lost 1 out of every 4 games that they played, and they would have to win 4 games in the college football playoff, 3 losses really does feel like a legitimate cutoff point for anything in terms of arguments or whether I want to believe in you. If you make the run, congratulations. But like that 3rd loss is significant to me in terms of ability to really make a 4-game run in the playoffs.
You are not consistent enough over the regular season to get that benefit of the doubt. I'm fine with that too. It ended up being the cut line of 3 with the conference championship. Auto bid got you in, but 3 without as an at-large didn't.
I'm kind of fine with that.
Yeah.
Conference championship. I'm fine with that.
Me too. The other topic I wanted to talk to you about, because we have talked a lot about seeding, so I think everyone kind of understands that as an issue, the calendar.
Yeah.
Did January 20th feel too late to crown a national champion?
Way too late. It was way too late. And it's because of what the NFL does, right? As soon as college football is over, and for people who didn't know this, like legally during the college football regular season, the NFL does not do Saturdays. Like that is not just a thing out of like respect for college football. They're not allowed to. But as soon as that thing ends, they take every damn day of the week. Any day of the week they want to play a game, they will play a game. And so I feel like we got so caught up in the NFL schedule by the time it gets to January 20 that there are people who are kind of like, oh, there's still a college football game. I also think that there's a little bit of fatigue, especially if you're one of the teams who went out early. It's like, why am I going to watch the rest of the 3 rounds of this thing? Like my team's not in there. If I watch it, I watch it. And if I don't, I'm fine. So I certainly think that there has to be something that happens to get this thing moved up a little bit earlier. Final thing I'll say, one of my friends, colleagues got married this past weekend, and she is somebody who works in college football. And she had planned her wedding for this specific weekend because she's like, oh, it'll be the week after college football ends, not thinking about the 12-team era. And I love her to death. But like, I think a lot of us were kind of there where we didn't really think about how long the season was actually going to go. And so for some people, it was literally out of sight, out of mind in terms of like their lifestyle and their viewing habits.
Yeah, I think that it felt very different coming on the heels of the NFL divisional weekend versus even wild card, where like there's blowouts in the wild card weekend. It doesn't quite take over a city sports bars in the same way. Like divisional games are a big deal, and they were really good games, and you had the snow and it looked awesome. So you go through a whole weekend of all of that, and then you're like, oh, right. Monday night. Yes. Monday night, famously college football night. Got to, think about watching a college football game. I think the layoff between the rounds was too long at different times as well. You kind of forgot about it, got a little fatigued talking about the games, thinking about the games. There's that 2-week break from the conference championships to the first round, which felt long at times, even though it felt much shorter than the old model used to be. So there were just different times where the rhythm felt off. You're playing on different days of the week. The best day is New Year's Day. That is college football's day. And what I think you need to do is have more of the meaningful games closer to the first. Agreed. And I would, if I can wave a magic wand, I would get rid of conference championship games. I think we saw that they were devalued in the new system. I know that they bring in lots of money for a lot of people, so it won't be until these contracts are up, probably, if they were ever going to consider it. But that would slide everything up a week. And I think if you did that, you can have these quarterfinal games on campus, and they're before, New Year's and the holidays, and you can have your semifinal games on New Year's Day, and then your championship game is back to kind of where it was about a week later. In a perfect world, I would also work with the NFL and have them do, they could put their playoff wildcard game, whatever, in the early afternoon, and let college football have a championship game on a Saturday night.
Yeah.
Because Saturdays are when college football is played. You can have parties. You can gather to watch the games instead of doing it on a Monday night. But this is my magic wand world.
I'm curious how trying to work with the NFL is going to go down, because that is an evil empire of an organization.
I know they keep latching onto everyone else's sporting day. They took over the NBA on Christmas.
They did. Christmas. I mean, they do whatever the hell they want to do and don't feel bad about it. And I'm very curious what that conversation would be like and what it would take for them to say, okay, we'll make a concession for the good of college football, which is the feeder system, by the way, for the NFL. So I do think they should have a vested interest, but neither here nor there.
Yeah, I agree. And CFP Executive Director Rich Clark, he said this past week after the CFP meetings that he has met with Roger Goodell. The NFL has, said that they would work with college football. Again, they did put some of their biggest brands up against the college football first round games on campus. So I don't know exactly, how optimistic anyone should be about that, but that's something to track. And so as we kind of start wrapping things up here, I did want to just discuss kind of where things go from here. I was, how much I love a good stakeout. I was part of the media stakeout of the college football playoff meetings on Sunday before the championship game. All the commissioners meet, all the presidents meet. And I was told they were kind of dancing around the issues and things that people actually wanted to debate. So they're going to meet again in February. They always have a big multiple day meeting in April when they rehash everything from the previous season. But they have to, if they're going to make any changes to the format or really how anything works for this coming season, so the 25 this fall, it has to be unanimous. And so when we talk about seeding issues, you would have to have unanimity with the Big 12, the ACC, the Mountain West, the American, all of these leagues where there's a ton of value in having 1 through 4 with buys go to conference champions. So you'd have to give up something there. Although, what I think is the easy tweak? I think you just pay them out what they would get from advancing from an extra round and adjust the seeding to match the rankings. But that has to be unanimous, which is why people are very skeptical that it would fully change for this year. And then I think Rich Clark was saying that for a standpoint of figuring out changes for 2026 and beyond, which is an entirely different contract and the governance structure is different, which is why we can sort of talk about the SEC and the Big Ten kind of dictating format changes. They believe that they can do that essentially unilaterally. There'll be input from others, but they can make these changes. Rich said that he thinks it needs to be done by the end of this calendar year because, again, there's not a lot of lead time. So I would love to see them discuss the sites of games. They have some agreements in place with the bowls. There's always been a history of, relationships with bowls, but it's like a compromise. It's weird. The college football playoff could run all of these events and these games themselves without the bowls. But right now, there's that piece of history with the sport. So I would love to see them evaluate the quarterfinal round, see if that could be something that could get played on campus. I think you're going to hear coaches pushing for that. You're going to hear a lot of athletic directors pushing for that and fans pushing for that because of how expensive it is to go to multiple neutral sites all over the country, depending on where your team plays. So those are things that I expect to kind of be there either, kind of in the more immediate or middle intermediate timeframe of discussions. The SEC and the Big Ten are going to have another joint meeting in February as well. So they did that back in the fall. I went in Nashville. They're doing it to kind of flex a little bit in college football and kind of get everyone a little bit nervous. But certainly they're going to talk about the CFP format, Joshua. And I do think eventually we're going to have more conversations about the idea of multiple AQs, 3 or 4 for each of those leagues, year in and year out. And then you can kind of structure some things around it. Do you have a third place game, championship weekend, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that piece is going to come back up here, as is like, do you go to a 14 team bracket versus 12, couple extra at large spots, and that adjusts the buys? And if there's 2 buys, do they go to the Big Ten, SEC champ? Like those types of conversations are going to start up again as well for that 2026 period.
The AQ conversation, I don't necessarily love, but I do think if it's built into this idea of having a play-in round to see, like, you take the top however many teams and they're playing for just those specific spots. That's something I think I could get on. It would feel a little bit better because, again, you're using competition as a way to fill those spots. Do you know where this meeting in February is going to take place?
I think it's New Orleans.
Oh, New Orleans. Hopefully no snow there in February.
Yeah. But yeah, I think, like, again, there's a lot of other issues they'll get into, like the house settlement and stuff that affects these schools more than everybody else. But the rest of college sports, like, is very nervous about how closely the SEC and the Big Ten are working on stuff. And certainly with their ability to really dictate things in the college football playoff, they're going to do things that are going to benefit them. Will be interesting to see if the SEC is more on board with the multiple AQs now, knowing, they fought really hard for Alabama to get in and they didn't, right? Like, wouldn't that have been nice to have another automatic spot? So those are topics and those are things that we're going to continue to track. I think these are all minor, right? Like the overall thing was, I think everyone's viewing it as a big success. So don't mess with the format too much. That's like the main thing, even if you are going to tweak it at the margins or fix the seating to match the rankings and things like that. So more meetings ahead. I'm sure I'll have more stakeouts ahead as well, but they will continue to track all of that. And we'll be here. We'll have Rushing the Field. It will exist in the off season. There's always stuff to talk about in college football. We'll also probably have some interviews, different figures around college football that hopefully you guys will all want to listen to as well. But I think that'll do it. I think we're going to put a bow on the 2024-25 college football season, Joshua.
It's crazy that we got here, so naive back at the beginning of the year. And now here we are through all the crazy games that we saw, through all the tweet storms from administrators about which teams should have been in. And here we are at the end of the season, Nicole.
Yeah, longest season ever in college football history. We made it. We survived it. We deserve a medal as well. It was tough on our bodies as well. I'm going to take a little bit of a break. You should take a break too. But the pod won't. So be sure to subscribe, rate, and review. We'll still be here. We really appreciate everyone who spent some time with us this season. And don't go anywhere. For Joshua Perry, I'm Nicole Auerbach. This is Rushing the Field, and we'll be back soon. Welcome to Rushing the Field. He's Joshua Perry. I'm Nicole Auerbach. And we're breaking down what this run to the national championship meant for Notre Dame and really where they go from now, Joshua. I mean, you've got a 39-year-old head coach who just played for a title in year 3 for the Fighting Irish. And you've got a quarterback of the future already in the program. A lot of key players coming back next year. Expectations will probably stay pretty high.
They should stay pretty high. And we'll start with the head coach and Marcus Freeman. I thought he did a phenomenal job this year, coming off of the NIU game, which everybody talks about. Being able to regroup his team and get them in a position to be in a national title game speaks to his leadership, but also the coaching job that he did there as well. They also dealt with a lot of injuries throughout the year. You had a first-round corner that got hurt. Your top edge rusher was out. Injuries across the offensive line. You're playing with a running back that's got a bad wheel at the end of the year. And those guys continued to fight. So I think he's built the culture that you can believe in as a team that can be a contender into the future. Now, you mentioned the quarterback, and I think that's going to be the big question for a lot of people. We've seen a couple transfers over the last year, but there's excitement about CJ Carr and what he can do. And in particular, does that open up the offense where we saw Riley Leonard a lot of times that ran through him with his legs? Is CJ a guy who can open it up on the edges? Jaden Greathouse, back-to-back great games to end the season. I'm excited to see that. But there is the question about the defense, of course, and is Al Golden going to be around? This Marcus Freeman specialty. I think they'll be fine. But ultimately, if we look at Notre Dame right now, and you asked at the beginning of the year, did you think they would be able to put this together? The answer would have been no. And based off of the fact that they did, I think they're in a great spot as they look toward the future and their ability to make another run.
Yeah, I think back to when I went and visited with Marcus Freeman in the preseason, and there were like no questions about the defense. And there were questions about the offense. And that was still Riley Leonard coming back in, coming off injuries, coming off a transfer, trying to get to know the system and build into it. And that's why they're excited about transitioning to a high school recruit developmental quarterback position instead of the 1-year transfers, to try to have that from year to year and to build that offensively in different areas that we didn't see, as you mentioned, with Jaden Greathouse and some of the passing game that I really think would have taken this team to a different level. Although, of course, they made it to the national championship game on the back of that run game. So we'll see what they look like next year. Hopefully they'll be able to stay a little bit healthier too, but lots to track in the offseason in South Bend and across all of college football. And we'll be here to do it here on Rushing the Field. This is a podcast where you can get all your college football news and analysis. You can find us on NBCSports.com or the NBC Sports YouTube channel, or really all major podcast platforms. For Joshua Perry, I'm Nicole Auerbach. Thanks for hanging out with us.